Yeah, I'm going to talk about some issues with XPS and closed cell spray foam. I'll try not to overlap with Anthony too much, and some alternatives. So I imagine everyone, absolute basics, closed cell spray foam is the one on the left. It's got a higher R value per inch than open cell. It's also more expensive. That's actually the price per square foot per R value. It's just one number. I know there you can get quite a range of prices out there, but it's a bit more pricey. But you can pack more R value in a smaller space. It's less vapor permeable, so it also acts as a vapor barrier. Be handy in some cases. It's using on the outside of the building. It's also a decent water barrier. So it has some advantages, and that's why it's fairly popular. XPS, once again, higher R value per inch. Also more expensive for that R value. Basically, you're paying that extra money. These products, they store a bit of refrigerant, as Anthony was mentioning. That's the reason why they have high global warming potentials. But that helps you out with a bit of a boost for R value. We're getting close to that with the graphite products coming into EPS. They're quite efficient. They're not quite at that R5 per inch level. Also, in terms of water, they're a bit more absorptive. Now, the products that you see here, sorry, Owens Corning, BSF, I tried to mix up products here as best I can, so my apologies if I'm one ahead or less or something. They do sell EPS with films on it, which are quite cheap, but water can still absorb in the sides of them, and people are just a bit nervous in some applications, which I'll get into. One thing I wanted to talk about, to set a bit of context, I was involved with the Netzero carbon building, so this is kind of the latest thing. Unfortunately, Netzero carbon that's operating, they have a requirement for you to report the embodied emissions, but there's no limit on how good or bad it is. So this building, for instance, it's got closed cell spray foam on the inside. It uses a lot of XPS. It's got 2 inches underneath, 4 inches up the foundation walls. It's got a sandwich precast that has XPS in it. So it's got quite a bit of XPS insulation as well. And we did Athena-based analysis. It's a bit old, so Anthony's points about these numbers might be low or hot, by a factor of 2, that sort of thing, noted or more, and also depending on how you account for them. But just to give a perspective, when I started this, it was, is this stuff significant at all? Well, if you're doing embodied carbon inventories for buildings, it's not just the concrete and steel. Even for this structure, which has, this analysis includes the structure holding the PV panels on the roof. It doesn't include the PV panels, but it adds up to quite a bit. This analysis here, this little pie chart, assumes the roof is XPS. I'm from Ontario, so we don't do that many inverted roofs. It's actually polyiso there, but assuming it was XPS, that's how much it would add up to. I got this from my friends at Elastochem. Once again, apologies, Owens Corning, BSF. I docked a few rows off this sheet that they send around where they're explaining the HFO products. Some of the interesting points to me, hopefully you can see my little cursor, but there is still reporting a range of R values. I have emailed Elastochem to see if this is just older test standard. I know the 03 test standard reports higher values than the 09 test standard, which you're required to use in Ontario, at least. I imagine across Canada by now. So I don't know if these differences in R values are real. Global warming potential that they have down here, that's just the refrigerant. you know, less than 1 number. So they, anyway, that's not all that useful. I had offered to give some insights that we have from our projects that have just started using the HFO-based spray foams. We're hearing from contractors that they install a little bit differently. So we've struggled for a long time with spray foam on getting it around steel studs, like the application that I showed earlier. Also people using it in other locations, which I'll get into before. And so I imagine, you know, there'll be an unfortunate learning curve to using the current products as well. So if you're getting into this, you know, extra oversight for how these are applied, because you might not get much air tightness out of them in large gaps. Not a whole lot of working experience in the how thick of a pass you can do with it. So normally with closed cell spray foam, you'd only do, say, a 2-inch pass, and then you'd have to wait a while, then come back again because it releases heat. I've heard from manufacturers that you can go thicker with these products because inherently they release less heat. Hasn't been proven out in the field yet. We definitely get called up all the time for people that spray way too much of the old stuff at once. So we're going to quickly find out whether or not you can actually do thick passes. That'll be interesting to see. And don't know a lot about the price differences yet. That's something still to come through. Yeah, you know, the XPS products, I can Google and find things on them, and they're in Europe. Don't see too much about them in North America. I think the one thing to look out for if you're downloading EPDs and using European products is they're not as set on hitting the R5 per inch number. And so they're probably mixing CO2s in with their refrigerants. So they're not an easy swap over for comparing to, say, if Dow came out with a product, or, you know, one of the BSF or Owens Corning, sorry, came out with the XPS product, it might be a little worse than what you're finding in the European products. The other thing, you know, putting this together that I couldn't ignore is folks that work with us and don't want to use spray foam or don't want to use XPS. It's not just global warming. You know, plastics from a fossil fuel, they're still concerned about that. I didn't see any of those reported recycled contents at 100. Not sure what the real values are for those recycled contents. I know that post-industrial recycled contents could be a nefarious sort of thing. And an increased focus on end of life. You know, I hear some people using the, you know, don't use the F word when you're designing a building. Probably largely related to these two concerns about some of it where it ends up. Saw this article in CBC on Friday. Some of the replacement refrigerants end up having persistent organic compounds. They could have very low global warming potential. They could have very low ozone depletion potential. Could end up with other issues. It seems, you know, environmentally a bit of, you know, I can understand from people that it feels like whack-a-mole, that we kind of move from one environmental issue to the other. So I do tip my hat to the natural building products folks who, you know, are worried about these things. So if you want to avoid it, I'm going to go through applications from bottom to top and try to stick within my remaining 10 minutes or so. So under slab, XPS kind of has the market right now. I do see some closed cell spray foam. Obviously, probably a lot of people on this call have experience with EPS. I think they're slowly taking over the market below slab because it's cheaper. You know, the product over here has a film on it, a fairly tough one, so that you can run radiant heating through it. There is mineral wool below slabs. I don't see a whole lot of it. And definitely if I was on a project, some of the notes from the technical bulletins from Rockwell would make me a bit nervous about not assuming that the slab actually rests on it and keeping it dry. I can tell you that Rockwool's manufacturing plant in Milton was built on mineral wool, and it's fine, and that their new head office in Toronto is. But anyway, I see a little bit of it, but not so much. The interior foundation walls, great application for a low vapor permeance foam product. XPS close cell spray foam, very popular. The alternatives, seeing you know, great application for smart vapor barriers, definitely in my climate in Ontario, where you know the vapor barrier is not a great fit for basements because the wall is generally wet, and so you know the humidity is often going in the wrong direction, and you see a lot of mold spotting issues on poly, at least in Ontario. I don't know how things are in Vancouver, but of course EPS products with films on them, similar easy swap for XPS or closed cell spray foam. So these ones I can go faster. I haven't split them up. So XPS on the outside of foundation walls, very, very common. However, we have a lot of experience now with EPS on the outside of foundation walls, mostly through ICF construction. Mineral wool also pretty common. The interior of walls, I think I have one project where they got XPS for free, so it was Habitat for Humanity. But otherwise, quite a bit of closed cell spray foam. I think people install it. They like the idea of it being an air barrier. However, you know, the photo below, you can see a lot of daylight from between all those double studs. You know, spray foam by itself isn't in these applications a perfect air barrier by any means. And there's lots of alternatives, obviously. And, you know, as a building scientist, I'd be remiss not to encourage people to move as much insulation as possible to the outside. So the exterior walls, folks love closed cell spray foam because you can go around these brick ties here or other attachments with fair ease, as opposed to having to cut around them or line them up at the edges of your board products. That's a pretty major advantage in the whole stream of things. However, you know, obviously there's lots of board alternatives. They're used en masse and have a large portion of the market. Attics, flash and fill seems to be a popular thing in rich people's houses. Once again, I think a perception that it's a great air barrier. I think functionally, and people who do blower door testing and passive house will tell you that it's not magic. You basically still need another air barrier, sheet air barrier, to achieve a high level of air tightness, just because it's hard to spray foam and capture all the complicated geometries that you'll typically get in an attic. We see lots of issues in Ontario where it's a bit colder, of frost and condensation in tricky attics on rich people's houses mostly, where they've tried to do spray foam and didn't end up with the air tightness they wanted, or tried to spray foam in ductwork in attics. Is difficult. It can be done right, but it's quite difficult. And obviously the alternative, if you're doing attic insulation, folks are pretty good at doing poly and cellulose or any other option, fiberglass up there in the attic. Unvented roofs. And so this is a big growth in closed cell spray foam use. So we're not as focused anymore on venting roof systems. Now that we've gotten quite airtight, we're not as focused on it. So if you're going to come up with a thinner roof and you're not going to vent it, you try to get as much R value as you can per inch, and that lends itself to closed cell spray foam. So we're seeing quite a bit of that. On the exterior of roofs, obviously low slope roofs is the major application. Inverted roofs, XPS seems to still be the way to go. There was a study by the US Navy where they pulled apart a bunch of roofs, or they they assembled data from many roofs on many buildings across the US. And they found that after 30 years or so, XPS seemed to hold up the best in terms of retaining its R value over time. Even if you had a polyiso or an EPS that had a film on it, the water would still go around it. And typically people don't do that for roofs anyway. So it seems like XPS still has the market for inverted roofs. And I don't see people really recommending other solutions for that, other than not doing an inverted roof and going with a conventionally insulated roof. Most likely polyiso or polyiso and rock will seem to be the approach. This is a challenging one for green buildings because a lot of the green roofs are installed as inverted roofs at this point, which may change as embodied carbon analysis becomes more and more popular. Parapets is an interesting one. The one on the left isn't quite what I normally would see. Normally, you wouldn't have the two sheets here. They would typically fill this full of foam, or in commercial construction, you know, this would be steel studs, and they would fill this full of foam as an air barrier. I can tell you last winter I was at a building and we could warm our hands with the amount of air that was coming past the spray foam. It's another one of these things that's tricky to do correctly and difficult to inspect. And as we go toward HFO-based foams, it worries me about getting even worse. The alternative to that is wrapping a membrane right underneath the parapet. This is often very difficult to do because the person who does the roofing isn't the same as the person who does the water-resistant barriers on the walls, and they don't really talk to each other or like each other, and they show up at different times, and often not achieved on a project, even if it's shown in details. A lot of pushback there. But that would be the ideal. And then just to finish it off, I didn't think I'd have time to go into all the odds and ends, but you know, spray foam in particular, and also XPS in some cases, is very handy for a lot of odds and ends. Complicated geometries, if you can get it filled properly, window surrounds, Q-deck overhangs, the inside surfaces of spandrel panel back pans. There's still a lot of applications where I think it will be a struggle to use other products for the foreseeable future. Well, not the foreseeable future, but for a while. And my summary, you know, when I was reached out, it seemed like looking for the end of closed cell spray foam XPS. I don't think that's going to happen. There's definitely competitors to them, but they're still going to be using them for some time. There's some areas where I think it's very tough to replace them, inverted roofs being one in particular, and also addressing complicated geometries. And I think you'll continue to see these products well into the future. So hopefully the folks at BASF and Owens Corning can do all kinds of magic to make them more environmentally friendly. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
So we have two questions. Kelsey, I'm gonna unmute you so you can ask your question.
Yeah, hey, I was wondering about, you were talking about doing different pass thicknesses with HFO versus HFC foam, and kind of what the advantage of going anything past 2 inches would be. And I mean, I guess that might be climate dependent, but does that represent a cost savings if you can go thicker with one pass because of labor savings?
Yeah. So
okay.
Wood frame construction, you know, people want to show up, do a house, and get out of there. So if you're filling an entire bat space or a compact roof, you're looking at 3.5 inches or 5.5 inches. So they'll want to do that, you know, they're not supposed to, but often they do that in one pass. Also, you know, that Mohawk College building had, let's see here, it had 7 inches of insulation in the walls, and the spray foam was a 3-inch. And so they would do that in 2 passes, the way that they had set it up, because the studs are offset. But you know, it's cheaper for the contractor and quicker if they can do it in one pass, essentially.
And the risk of doing it in one pass when you're doing it improperly is that you lose R value, and that the material is just installed improperly, and lifespan, like everything about that, lifespan, etc.
Yeah, so if you do it in one pass, let's say you take today's spray foam and HFC spray foam and do it and spray it like 6 inches thick. You can probably try this with the Great Stuff can, you know, at your house ordeal. You'll notice the middle of it will burn out. It'll turn gray. And if there's a little bit of it, it's not a big deal really. But if it starts to fall apart and crumble, and you can end up with some real problems then. So we're often called in to go and do cutaways of spray foam where they suspect this has happened, and then make judgments on whether or not they should rip it out and redo it. And
then so that's why you get the certified installers, because hopefully they're actually doing it properly.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's a big deal. The other big deal is that if they haven't stored the chemicals properly, they don't necessarily set within the given 24 hours. And so I'd be particularly nervous being somebody moving back into their house, say after their basement was done. I've heard some real horror stories about, just that toxic exposure can cause problems.
Okay, awesome. And the next question is from Hayo Meyer. Can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, by the way, you pronounce my name very well.
Well,
a couple questions. I think the first one, pretty quick. The flash and fill, I'm not familiar with that term.
You know, say you're building, I often see this in houses, but it's also done in the odd multi-unit residential building. Before you fill up the attic with cellulose or blown fiberglass, they go up with spray foam, and they spray 1 inch or 2 of spray foam just all over the tops of the drywall and over the joists and everything. The difficulty is a lot of people who install that stuff, they get paid per board foot, so per inch, and they look at it like that's what they're getting paid for, not to install an air barrier. And so they are not often focused on it. And also B, it can be very difficult, especially with complicated roof geometries. And so the middle part is, you know, the closed cell spray foam is expensive. You still got a lot of attic left. So then you beef up the rest of the R value with something cheaper.
And so it's supposed to replace an air barrier or a vapor barrier?
It's intended to replace a vapor barrier, an air vapor barrier.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, and then, yeah, I don't know if I have still time, but I think I've seen an inverted roof with rock wool from Suprema.
Oh.
Have you seen that?
Nope. I haven't seen it. I'm curious.
Yeah, maybe just check out their website. I think they have a system. I'm going to double check too, see if that's actually what they offer. But
yeah, no, I think, well, it's possible. You know, things could be changing with inverted roofs. If they do a better and better job of draining the insulation itself, I think you could get away with products other than XPS. But not much experience out there.
Right, because the problem is a lot of other products, they take on that moisture.
Yeah, like if rock wool was sitting in water for 20 years, it would get wet and not potentially do much. Like it washes out the mineral oils and whatnot that are in it that keep it hydrophobic. And then B, I would worry about if it's an inverted roof that people are walking on, it might get squishy.
Mm. Okay, thank you.
Yes, awesome. That's all our questions.
Awesome.